That's another perfectly intriguing Sherlock title. Sherlock Holmes and the Thread Found in the Firewood. It's subtle, grounded, and deeply mysterious. The kind of clue no one else would notice, yet one that unravels an entire crime. A single thread among ashes, a whisper of truth that survived the fire. Here's your cinematic, expanded intro, written in your signature mystery narrator tone, with natural hook lines, engagement, and your signature T closer. Surantindi. It began in the warmth of a quiet London home. A fire crackling, rain tapping softly against the window panes, nothing unusual. Until the maid, clearing out the ashes, found something that shouldn't have survived the flames. A single thread, burnt at the edges, almost invisible, yet bright enough to catch the eye of a detective who notices everything. When Sherlock Holmes examined it, his expression changed. What looked like a thread was a map of deceit, a story woven through lies and smoke, because sometimes the smallest thing that refuses to burn is the truth itself. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if mysteries like this spark your curiosity, make sure to like this video and subscribe. Because every week, another hidden clue comes to light here on Baker Street. Now, pick up your cup of tea, sit closer to the fire, and watch carefully. This is Sherlock Holmes and the Thread Found in the Firewood. Chapter 1. The thread found in the firewood. It was in the first chill of March, during one of those sullen afternoons when London seemed to curl inwards from its own gloom, that Sherlock Holmes, with pipe in hand and eyes half closed, stared into the embers of the hearth at Baker Street. Outside, the fog clawed at the windows like some prowling beast, and the lamplighter's footsteps echoed like ghostly punctuation through the stillness of the street. I had only returned that morning from a brief visit to the countryside, and the warmth of our fire, along with Holmes's familiar silhouette, was a welcome sight. He had scarcely acknowledged my entrance, save for a lifted brow and a murmured observation that I had encountered heavy rain near Guildford, that I had paused at the King's Head Inn, and that I had made the acquaintance of a man with a golden retriever, whose breed had left no fewer than 4 distinct hairs upon my right cuff. I have long ceased to ask how he deduces these things. I merely marvel at the precision of his logic, and, as ever, attempt to record it faithfully. Holmes stirred suddenly and reached for a folded note on the side table. "You have arrived at the precise moment of need, Watson," he said, handing it to me. "Read." The handwriting was hurried but elegant. It bore the crest of the County Constabulary of Surrey and read, "Mr. Holmes, I beg your immediate assistance. A matter of most disturbing and inexplicable nature has arisen at Northburn Hollow, near Chiselham Wood. I dare not trust any local conclusions. The matter may appear petty at first glance, but I assure you something grave lies beneath. I can provide details only in person. I shall arrive at Baker Street by 3:30. Inspector Mallory, I looked at the clock. It lacked 10 minutes of the appointed time. Northburn Hollow, I mused. It rings no bell. A small estate on the eastern edge of Surrey, Holmes replied. Remote, near dense woodland. Not much of a village, more a collection of cottages and a manor house. An ideal place for mischief that prefers seclusion. And Mallory? A promising inspector, Holmes said. Young, too clever for his superiors, which will either advance his career swiftly or doom it entirely. No sooner had he spoken than we heard a firm knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a man of 35 or so, cloaked in damp wool and still bearing the stains of rural travel. His eyes were sharp, and his manner brisk but not impolite. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I'm grateful for your time." "You have it," Holmes said, motioning him to the armchair. "What has occurred in Northburn Hollow?" Mallory glanced between us. "It concerns the death of a local man, Alfred Headley. He was the groundskeeper at Wetherell Grange, a modest estate owned by Lady Rothmere. 3 days ago, Headley was found dead in his cottage, the fire in the grate nearly spent. His body collapsed before it. The village doctor pronounced it heart failure, but He paused, producing a small parcel wrapped in cloth from his coat pocket. I thought you might wish to see this. He placed it on the table and opened it. Inside lay a length of coarse twine, perhaps 8 inches long, but dyed a peculiar, deep, rust-red hue, as though once soaked in blood and later scorched by flame. Its fibers were charred at one end. "We found that in his firewood box," Mallory said quietly, "tucked between split logs, not in the fire itself. And here is the curious part. No rope or binding of that nature was ever used in Headley's work or kept on the estate." Holmes leaned forward, fingers steepled. "And you say the man died of heart failure?" "So it was declared," Mallory said. "But Headley was not old, 52, active, and Lady Rothmere claims he had never once seen a physician. I examined the room myself before the body was moved. Something felt wrong, no signs of a struggle. But," he hesitated, "the hearth had been cleaned recently." "Impossibly so, freshly blacked, as though someone had gone to great lengths to obscure something." Holmes lifted the thread delicately with a pair of tweezers from his desk. He turned it under the lamplight, watching its fibers shimmer faintly. "You are right to come to me," he murmured. "This is not ordinary twine, not British make, possibly hand-spun, and the scent—" He brought it close to his nose. "Faint, very faint. Resin, camphor, possibly cedar oil. Why would a man like Headley have something like that among his firewood?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Precisely, Watson. And what might he have burned, or been about to burn, that someone else did not wish found?" Mallory nodded. "The household swears he had no visitors that night. But his dog was missing when they found him. Dead? Vanished. No trace." "Animals seldom lie," Holmes said, standing abruptly. "Prepare yourself, Watson. We leave for Northburn Hollow on the 6 o'clock train." "But what do you suspect?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "I suspect that Alfred Headley saw something he was not meant to see, and that whatever he found, he tried to burn. But a thread remained. A thread someone believed had also turned to ash. That mistake may cost them dearly." Mallory stood. "Thank you both. I'll arrange a carriage to meet us at the station." As the inspector departed into the encroaching fog, Holmes turned back to the fire. "Watson, remember this," he said. "It is not always the corpse that tells the tale. Sometimes it is what the fire refuses to consume." And with that cryptic remark, the first flame of the mystery was lit. Chapter 2. The Ashes Beneath the Grate. The countryside always held a strange duality for me. A sense of bucolic peace underlaid by the impression of hidden things, like whispers behind hedgerows. As our train rumbled out of Victoria Station and south into Surrey, I noted how Holmes grew increasingly silent, his grey eyes fixed on some unseen thought. He scarcely touched the coffee brought by the attendant, and answered my idle queries with nothing more than a hum or an absent nod. Inspector Mallory had taken the opposite seat in our compartment, arms crossed, his gaze alternating between the damp fields flashing past the window and Holmes's impassive face. "You've not asked me for the specifics of Headley's last hours," he said at last, breaking the hush. "I prefer to see the setting with fresh eyes," Holmes replied. "Facts delivered second-hand often come seasoned with assumptions. But I would hear the official shape of it now, if only to measure it against what the scene truly says." Mallory nodded. "Very well. Headley was last seen just after dusk by a maid returning from the village. She passed by his cottage and saw the light through the window. Nothing unusual. The next morning, Lady Rothmere's coachman, Ewan Cray, went to collect him for work. found the door ajar. Headley was on the floor before the fireplace. No signs of trauma. The doctor came. Heart failure, he said. But the hearth, it had been scrubbed. Meticulously. Even the brickwork. Not something a dying man would think to do. And no one entered the cottage between dusk and morning? I asked. No one admits to it, Mallory said grimly. But there are no locks on the doors in Hollow. Holmes stirred slightly. The dog? A wiry brown terrier, always with Headley. No one's seen it since. Animals are poor at discretion, Holmes murmured, which is why their silence is so often unnatural. The remainder of the journey passed without further conversation. At Chisleham Station, a small covered trap waited for us, the horse already snorting in the sharp air. We rode beneath a ceiling of leaden clouds, Mallory pointing out the narrow road that would take us into the woodlands and, beyond them, the hamlet of Northburn Hollow. It was precisely as Holmes had described. Remote, sparsely populated, and strangely still. A half-dozen cottages nestled around a patch of green that had long since surrendered to bramble. Beyond them, barely visible behind leafless hedges, stood the low, moss-covered silhouette of Wetherell Grange. Headley's cottage stood apart from the rest. On the edge of the tree line, smoke no longer rising from its chimney. Inside, it was dim, the light creeping in like an unwelcome guest. The air carried the scent of damp stone and old ash. The room had been left much as it was found. A wooden table, a single chair, shelves of tools and oil tins, and the small iron grate where the final fire had been lit. Holmes said nothing for a long while. He knelt by the hearth, examining the brickwork, the firewood box, the iron tongs. "Note the floorboards, Watson," he said quietly. "They creak, badly." I stepped where he indicated. Sure enough, the board groaned beneath my heel. No sign of those boards being lifted. No rugs to conceal tampering. He took a glass vial from his coat and scraped along the inside edge of the grate, collecting a faint gray residue. After sniffing it, he tapped a speck onto the tip of his tongue, then spat it into a cloth. "Odd," he muttered. "That should not be there." "What is it?" Mallory asked. "Traces of benzoin resin, a fragrant preservative, often used to seal old documents or perfumes in finer households, but certainly not something a groundskeeper keeps in his cottage." He stood and moved to the firewood box. The logs were hewn in irregular lengths, some pale with bark still attached. Holmes ran his fingers along the bottom, stopping suddenly at a faint scrape along the grain. There. He withdrew a second object. A narrow splinter, its end blackened, its other edge bearing faint cloth fibers, red, and of the same shade as the thread we had seen in Baker Street. Holmes handed it to me with care. "What does that suggest to you, Watson?" I turned it over. Whatever the twine was wrapped around, it burned. But not entirely. And it burned among these logs. Precisely. Which means the object was hidden in the firewood and only partly consumed. But why hide it here? And why take such care to scrub the hearth clean afterward? Mallory looked around uneasily. "You think someone returned to the scene after Headley's death?" Holmes nodded. "Almost certainly. The doctor was called well after sunrise. That leaves ample time for someone to come in, find the fire had not burned as cleanly as hoped, and then cover their tracks. But it was a poor job. Too perfect, too deliberate. An honest hearth has soot. This one gleamed like a surgical tray." He turned toward the door. "Let us speak to the mistress of the house." Wetherell Grange was not a grand estate, but a relic of Georgian simplicity. Wide stone steps, ivy-laced columns, and frost-rimed windows. A maid admitted us with a tight-lipped nod and led us to the drawing-room, where Lady Rothmere awaited us. She was a woman of about 60, thin but erect, dressed in austere mourning black, despite the absence of any recent family deaths. Her eyes were bright and restless. "You must be Mr. Holmes. Inspector Mallory tells me you are unconventional." "I consider that a compliment," Holmes said with a slight bow. "You will forgive my candor, then," she said briskly. This obsession with poor Mr. Headley's death, it seems misplaced. He was a solitary man, perhaps prone to secrets, but he served this household loyally for nearly 20 years. Would you say he had enemies? None here, though he kept his own counsel. He had no kin, no debts. He owned a dog he doted on. Wretched creature yapped at everything. I was almost grateful it vanished. Holmes raised a brow. You said vanished, not ran away. Are you certain the latter didn't occur? Lady Rothmere hesitated. It would not have left his side willingly. Holmes nodded, filing the statement away. And did Headley ever receive visitors? Occasionally someone from the village, but not in recent weeks, though. She paused, as if regretting the words. Yes? A fortnight ago, I heard voices outside his cottage late at night. One of the maids heard it too, raised tones, but when I asked Headley the next day, he claimed it was nothing. That he'd been shouting at a fox. Did he often do that? Never before. Holmes inclined his head. That may prove more telling than you suspect, Lady Rothmere. As we left the grange, the sky had begun to darken, and the trees leaned close in the wind. He was shouting at someone, Holmes murmured. Or something. And whatever it was, it left more than just a scorched thread behind. We said little as we walked back toward the village, but I could not shake the sense that we were circling a presence that had yet to make itself known. The firewood had burned, but its secret had not entirely turned to ash. Chapter 3. The Man. With the birchwood eyes, the wind had begun to carry a peculiar bite as we crossed back through the hamlet's narrow track. Northburn Hollow seemed held in a kind of arrested breath, the cottages sunken into themselves, shutters half closed, as if even the buildings sensed something unspoken in the air. Holmes walked ahead, head bowed against the rising gusts, his coat flaring behind him like a bird's torn wing. I and Inspector Mallory followed in silence, each lost in the puzzle that had begun to stir in the ashes. Our destination now was the village inn, the Broken Stag, an aging, timber-framed structure sagging beneath the weight of its own years. Mallory had arranged rooms there, and it also served as the local gathering place, such as it was. Holmes had expressed a desire to observe the atmosphere, which I knew to mean more than ale and idle talk. Inside, the inn offered a modest fire and the aroma of baked root vegetables and old pipe smoke. A handful of villagers sat hunched over their mugs, glancing up only momentarily as we entered. Behind the bar stood a gaunt man with a stovepipe neck and a face that had likely never been introduced to a smile. Mallory exchanged a nod with him. "Mr. Cray," he said, "coachman to Wetherell Grange." Holmes stepped forward with a quiet grace. "Mr. Cray, I presume? I'm told you discovered Mr. Headley's body." Cray nodded. Was I? He had the kind of voice that sounded like stones being dragged in a leather sack. His eyes were the shade of pale birchwood, watery and strangely distant. "What did you see?" Cray scratched his neck slowly. "Door was open. Not wide, just a crack. Dog didn't bark. That struck me first. Always barked." Holmes tilted his head. "Had the door ever been left open before?" "Never. Headley was a careful man. Kept that dog close, too. Did you enter immediately?" "I did. Called his name. Got no answer. Found him just as they told you. On the floor. Head turned to the side like he were listening to something." Holmes's brow furrowed slightly. "Like he were listening?" "Aye. Eyes open, mouth too. Not like a man asleep. More like waiting for something he didn't want to hear." The bar had gone unusually quiet. Even the old clock above the hearth seemed to tick more slowly. Holmes gestured toward the corner table. "May we sit, Mr. Cray?" The coachman nodded, following us with a stiff gait. Once seated, Holmes leaned forward, fingers steepled. "Tell me, Mr. Cray, do you believe Headley was frightened of anything?" Cray took a long time to answer. "Not scared, but uneasy. For the past week he'd go out at night. always after dark. No lantern. I seen him once near the south edge of the grange, just staring into the trees, like he were listening for someone, or something. What direction was he facing? Cray pointed. Toward the old black pine cluster, where the ground dips. Ain't much there, but foxes and thorn. Holmes gave an almost imperceptible nod. Did you speak with him about it? Asked him once. He said I was dreamin', but I know what I saw. Mallory cleared his throat. Did you hear the raised voices Lady Rothmere mentioned? The night 2 weeks ago? Cray blinked. I did. Thought he was arguing with that poacher, Jeremy Finch. Finch has been seen snooping through the woods lately, but Headley wouldn't say. Holmes turned his gaze toward the bar. And what of Mr. Finch? Cray hesitated, then lowered his voice. You'll find him in the back room, drinking off the rain, keeps to himself. But if you ask me, he knows more than he's said. With that, Holmes rose and strode toward the curtained archway at the back of the inn. Mallory and I exchanged a glance and followed. We found Finch seated alone, a short man with a wiry build, thick red beard, and a squinting gaze that never quite settled. He looked up as we approached, the corner of his mouth twitching with cautious recognition. You're the Baker Street fellow, he said. Holmes didn't sit. Jeremy Finch, you've a reputation for trespassing and little else. Finch snorted. That reputation keeps me out of worse trouble. 2 weeks ago, Holmes said, you were heard arguing outside Alfred Headley's cottage. Why? Finch stiffened. Didn't argue. Asked him a question. He didn't answer it. That's not the same. Holmes's eyes narrowed. What question? Finch shifted. I wanted to know what he'd seen. That's all. What had he seen? The poacher stared at the table. That's the trouble. I don't know, but I saw him come out of the woods 2 nights before. Real late. He was carrying something wrapped in oilcloth, long, like a ledger or a scroll. I asked what it was, and he told me to keep walking. Did you see what he did with it? No, but I heard him the next night. Burning something. I smelled resin, like varnish and tree pitch. Not a normal fire. Holmes remained silent for a long beat. Then he said, Do you know where in the woods he came from? Finch hesitated. South side, near that hollow dip behind the pine stand. Ground's soft there. Easy to lose your footing. Without another word, Holmes turned and left the room, his strides brisk. We followed, barely keeping pace. Outside, the wind had turned sharp and bitter. You believe the object burned was something Headley recovered in the woods, I said. Holmes nodded. And I believe he only burned part of it, or was interrupted. Interrupted by whom? That, Watson, is the question. But it's not the only one. Why scrub the hearth? Why remove the dog? Why leave a thread, but no ashes? As we approached the edge of the village, Holmes stopped and pointed toward the black silhouette of pine trees in the distance. There's something buried in those woods, he said. Not just beneath the ground, but beneath silence. Headley tried to expose it, but something, or someone, made certain he did not finish the task. Mallory's jaw tightened. Do we investigate tonight? Holmes shook his head. No, we wait. Tonight the forest watches us. Tomorrow we go where Headley went. And as we turned back toward the inn, I could not help but glance behind, toward the trees that leaned unnaturally against the sky, like figures straining to hear what we might do next. Chapter 4. The Gathering of Shadows There are few moments in my long association with Sherlock Holmes which I remember with such vivid unease as that evening in Edwin Maberly's drawing room. The chess piece, the bishop, blackened and once thought lifeless, had not fallen by accident. I am a man of medicine and logic, yet even I felt a tingling on my skin, as though the room itself had inhaled and was waiting to exhale. Holmes remained perfectly still after the piece toppled, his eyes, that strange blend of detachment and fire, fixed on the board. For several moments no one spoke. Then, quite casually, He righted the bishop again. "Now we wait," he said softly, and returned to the hearth as though the event had been no more than a candle flickering in a draught. "I confess," I said, "I find it difficult to dismiss what we've seen as mere coincidence." "Good," he replied. "Then your instincts remain intact. And yet you're calm. Not calm, Watson, focused. The distinction is essential." He began to pace the room slowly, fingers joined at the chin. "Let us gather the facts. We have a dead man, no visible cause of death, a shattered window, blown outward, a visitor who came and left without passage, without trace, a lingering warmth at the sill, and now a chess piece, presumed inert, that responds to provocation." I hesitated. "You believe we are dealing with something unnatural?" He paused. "No, but I believe the crime has been dressed in the garments of the unnatural, as a magician cloaks his trick in darkness, so the audience sees only what he allows." Holmes gestured toward the bishop. "There are wires that can move chess pieces. That much is trivial. But no wire would explain the scent in the upholstery, the warped pocket watch, the sigh that preceded death. No single device, no simple trick, which tells me the method is layered, and that the motive must match its complexity." At that moment, a knock came at the front door. 3 short raps, sharp and certain. Holmes froze, then smiled. "She arrives, Watson." I stood, puzzled. "Who?" He stepped quickly to the staircase. "Come. We shall meet our first suspect." We descended to the front hall, where a constable was already greeting a woman at the threshold. She was cloaked in deep plum velvet, her hair pinned with sharp precision, and though her features were striking, there was something in the set of her jaw that hinted at calculation. "Miss Lydia Broom," she said, offering her hand. "I believe you are expecting me." Holmes gave a small bow. "Indeed, Miss Broom. I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. You are the former ward of Mr. Maberly, are you not?" "Until my 25th birthday," she said. "After that, I was simply the woman who refused his money." "Yet you've returned." Her expression cooled. "The housekeeper sent word. I did not think much of it, until I heard of his death through other channels." "You mean through the Maberly niece?" Holmes asked. Lydia Broom raised one eyebrow. "Abigail?" "No, I haven't spoken to her in over a year." We led her into the drawing room. She glanced at the broken window but said nothing, taking in the scene with quick, sweeping eyes. "I see the house is as he left it," she murmured. Holmes remained by the fire. "You knew the man well?" "Well enough to leave." "And yet you returned," she exhaled slowly. "Because I knew this would happen. I told him more than once. Someone would catch up to him." Holmes cocked his head. "Catch up to him?" Lydia turned, her face hardening. "My guardian had enemies, Mr. Holmes. Real ones. He represented dangerous clients. And he collected more than legal fees. Secrets, papers, confessions. He kept them here, I think. Not in a safe, but in something no one would suspect." "Like a chessboard?" She blinked. "Exactly." Holmes's smile was razor-thin. "Tell me, Miss Broom, did you ever see him receive letters from a woman?" Her composure flickered. "Yes," she said slowly. "Always the same wax seal. But he would never speak of her, only that she was dangerous. Not to him, but to herself." "Did you ever meet her?" "No, but I heard her voice once. From the hall." Holmes leaned forward. "What did it sound like?" "Not quite real," she whispered. "Too soft, like breath through silk." Watson and I exchanged glances. Holmes nodded slowly. "You've been most helpful. But I must ask, were you here, Miss Broom, the day before Maberly's death?" She hesitated. "Yes, briefly. Why conceal it earlier? I had no desire to be tied to his final hours. But I did not harm him. I swear it." "And did you see the chessboard, then?" Her brow furrowed. "Yes, it was mid-game. He always played black against white. Both sides himself." Holmes turned away, thoughtful. Miss Broom gathered her cloak. "If there's nothing else—" "One thing," Holmes said without turning. "When you left yesterday, did you see anyone watching the house?" She paused at the door. "Yes, a man, across the street. He wore gray gloves and a bowler hat, though I never saw his face." When she had gone, Holmes closed the door gently behind her and turned to me. "Well, Watson." "She's holding something back," I said. "Something she doesn't dare admit. But I believe she's frightened, not deceitful." Holmes smiled. "An astute observation. The man in gray, if he exists, may be the key to the riddle. But for now—" He returned to the drawing-room and, to my surprise, knelt by the fireplace once more. From behind the coal grate, he extracted a folded scrap of linen, scorched but intact. Embedded in its weave were letters, blackened but legible. "Sacrifice the bishop. She watches the queen." Holmes handed it to me without comment. "What does it mean?" I asked. He tapped the chessboard, where the bishop had once again fallen of its own accord. "It means," he said, "we are no longer the only players in this game." Chapter 5. A pawn in the parlor by the next morning, the mood in Baker Street was unusually solemn. The fire had long since died, and yet Holmes had not moved from the armchair. He sat unmoving, the scorched linen message folded precisely in his fingers. The words still echoed in my mind. "Sacrifice the bishop. She watches the queen." I cleared my throat as I poured coffee from the sideboard. Chess metaphors, cryptic instructions, a shattered window, and a visitor who doesn't leave footprints. Holmes? We're bordering on the fantastic. "And yet," Holmes murmured without shifting, "every fantasy has a spine of logic, Watson. The trick is finding it." "You believe the message was meant for Maberly?" "Perhaps, or perhaps not. It could be a warning, or an invitation. And what concerns me most is the final phrase, 'She watches the queen.'" I frowned. "A woman? The same mysterious visitor?" "Possibly. Or it may be that queen refers not to a person, but a role." "Think, Watson. What do we know of our suspects? Abigail Maberly, the niece. Calm, composed, too composed. Lydia Broom, the former ward, conflicted, certainly afraid, and both with histories tied to the deceased." Holmes nodded. "One conceals her presence. The other confesses but omits. And both, I suspect, are part of something larger." I watched him rise and step to the window, where the London morning had barely begun to bleach the fog from the street. A milkman passed, and somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice, then fell silent. "Where are we going?" I asked, recognizing that particular gleam of movement in his frame. "To the pawn," he said simply. "Pawn?" Holmes retrieved his hat and coat, and from a drawer took a slip of paper marked with a name and address. Mr. Caleb Voss, Voss and Perrott, Curios and Antiquities, Berwick Street, Soho. Mr. Edwin Maberly, Holmes explained as we descended the stairs, sold a number of items discreetly over the past 6 months. Not to auction houses, mind you, but to specialty dealers, including a certain Mr. Voss. Among the objects was an antique chess set carved from bone and ivory, a unique set created in Alsace around 1835, each piece engraved. Engraved? Holmes nodded. Subtle marks beneath the base, initials, symbols. We found R on the bishop. I believe Maberly was attempting to unravel something, or perhaps to finish something left long undone. When we arrived at Voss and Perrott, I was surprised to find the storefront unassuming. A narrow entrance tucked between a tobacconist and a bookseller. Its windows were filled with the usual curiosities: rusted compasses, fractured porcelain, brass doorknobs polished to a lonely gleam. Inside, the air was thick with beeswax and aged wood. Mr. Caleb Voss, a gaunt man in a brown waistcoat, regarded us through pince-nez spectacles with no evident surprise. "I've been expecting you," he said, his voice as dry as old paper. Word travels quickly among collectors when a client expires under unusual circumstances. Holmes gave a courteous nod. "Then you know of Mr. Maberly's passing?" "I do, and I imagine you're here about the board." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "You still have it?" Voss gestured to the back room. "Not the full set, but one piece, yes. He sold them individually, claimed they held personal memories he wanted to release." Holmes and I followed Voss into the narrow space beyond the counter. There, beneath a glass cloche, lay a single chess piece, a pawn. It was carved from ivory, its base marked with an ornate letter A and a faint spiral etched along its crown. Holmes bent low. He chose to sell the weakest piece last. "Not the weakest," Voss corrected. "The most faithful." Holmes looked up sharply. "Explain." Holmes exhaled. "She's not a ghost, Watson." "Then what?" "A memory sustained through ritual, anchored to this place by fear, guilt, and the unfinished game." We stood in silence as the wind shifted. Holmes turned slowly to me. "3 pieces remain. The knight, the rook, and the queen." He returned to the codex and turned the pages until he found the diagram he sought. "At the center of every board," he said, "is the place where choice is made. She is waiting for someone to make that move." "Holmes," I asked, my voice low, "are we playing the game now?" He met my eyes. "No, Watson. We've already played. And now it is her turn." Chapter 7. A Game Without Players. The following day dawned gray and scentless, the London fog lying over the rooftops like a pall. Holmes had not slept. He had remained in the drawing-room of Baker Street through the early hours, poring over the codex and cross-referencing its arcane diagrams with his own scrawled notes. He had spoken little, and when he did, it was mostly to himself. A low, murmuring stream of thought punctuated by phrases such as symbolic displacement and ritual closure dependent on memory, not intention. I brought him a pot of tea at 7:30. He did not look up, but gestured toward a page in the codex as I set it beside him. "There's something here, Watson," he said. "A reference to the unanchored queen. It implies that the queen, once removed from the board, cannot be replaced. Her role changes. She ceases to move like the others. She becomes the observer." I sank into the opposite chair, warming my hands on the porcelain. "Then the figure we saw in the window. She is no longer a player." Holmes tapped the side of the teacup absently. "Precisely. She was once. She moved, chose, loved, lost. But now she exists after the board, in the memory that keeps the game unfinished. And we are caught between the rules she remembers and the rules she has rewritten." It was nearly noon when a visitor arrived. Mrs. Hudson, flustered and unusually pale, led a tall, lean man into the sitting room. He wore a charcoal coat, impeccably pressed, and gray gloves that looked as though they had never known the damp. "Inspector Lestrade sent me," the man said briskly, removing his hat. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. My name is Basil Harrow. I'm an archivist for the City of London Law Courts. My presence here, I believe it intersects your current inquiry." Holmes gestured for him to sit. "Your name was not among the ones associated with Mr. Maberly's estate." "It wouldn't be," Harrow said. "I came across his name while combing through sealed documents, arbitration papers from 1867, long forgotten. Maberly was not a participant. He was a witness." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Witness to what?" Harrow drew a thin folder from his satchel. A confidential inquiry into the sudden disappearance of a Hungarian woman, Aurelia Vörös, the sister of a chess master who fled Budapest after a scandal involving falsified matches and a nobleman's suicide. I exchanged a glance with Holmes. Vörös, Holmes repeated. Laszlo Vörös, author of the Codex. Harrow nodded. Indeed, Aurelia disappeared not long after the scandal. Rumors suggested she held secrets about the matches, about the nobleman's death. Even that she played a role in falsifying the games. But what caught my attention, Mr. Holmes, is this. He produced a faded courtroom sketch. It depicted a young woman with elegant posture and distant eyes. One hand rested on her lap. The other, unmistakably, held an ivory queen. Holmes took the image gently. "And you believe Maberly knew her?" "He testified under seal," Harrow replied. "Claimed she came to him one night in London in the year 1870. Said she was being pursued. She begged him to hide the chess set, the real one, not a replica. She feared that if it remained together, it would continue the game of loss. Maberly agreed. So he scattered the pieces," Holmes murmured, "but could not let them go." Harrow nodded. The trial ended in silence. The documents were sealed. But this image, this face, it matches a photograph in Maberly's personal study. I'm certain of it. "She is the queen," I said quietly. "Not metaphorically. She was the queen on the board." Holmes looked up at Harrow. "Do the documents say what happened to her?" "No. She vanished again. Some claimed suicide. Others claimed madness. But the board remained." Holmes stood abruptly. "Mr. Harrow, I thank you. You've brought clarity to a mystery wrapped in centuries of forgetting." Harrow hesitated. "Do you believe the game is still being played?" Holmes turned back to the fire. "No. I believe the game ended long ago, but the board doesn't know that yet." After the archivist left, Holmes turned to me. "We must return," he said. "To Maberly's study. Tonight." I nodded. "To do what?" "To end the game." That evening we arrived once more at Wellington Place. The constables had long since withdrawn. The house sat vacant and mute. Holmes carried only a satchel and a lantern. He moved without hesitation up the stairs and into the sealed study. There he placed the three known pieces, bishop, pawn, queen, onto the desk in a precise triangle. Then, from his satchel, he retrieved two small items wrapped in cloth, the knight and the rook. "Where did you—" "I had them traced," he said. "The rook was sold to a chess club in Battersea, the knight to a collector in Knightsbridge. I retrieved both this afternoon." He paused, then added, "The king was never carved. The set was made deliberately incomplete." "No king?" Holmes shook his head. "Aurelia never believed the king should decide the game. Only those who lost something could claim the right to shape its end." He arranged the pieces carefully, consulting the codex one final time. Then he extinguished the lantern. In the hush of that narrow room, a strange thing occurred. The temperature dropped slightly. A faint hum, like the friction of memory against silence, filled the air. And then the pieces began to tilt. The rook tipped backward. The knight turned in place. The queen lifted, as if by unseen fingers, and fell gently to its side. Holmes whispered, "Checkmate." The hum ceased, and somewhere in the house below, a sound, so soft it might have been the settling of dust, sighed through the hallway. We descended in silence. The drawing room had changed. The air was warmer now. The shattered glass had ceased to moan in the wind, and in the place where the bishop had stood, nothing remained, not even ash. Holmes turned to me. "It is over," he said. "The board is empty." Chapter 8. The Hand That Moved the Queen. The next morning, I awoke to find Holmes already bathed, dressed, and at work by the hearth. A soft breeze pushed through the half-open window, disturbing the stack of telegrams on the writing table. Holmes stood with one hand resting on the mantel, his gaze distant, yet not unfocused. He had not touched breakfast. "Is it truly over?" I asked, setting down my cup. "The board, the pieces, Aurelia. Do you believe we've brought it to a close?" Holmes remained silent for a moment before turning toward me. "The board, yes," he said. "The memory? Perhaps. But the hand that moved the Queen, that remains unknown." "You mean someone still alive?" He nodded slowly. "Someone who knew the rules. Someone who orchestrated the return of the pieces. Who brought the codex back into play. Who ensured Maberly's end appeared not only puzzling, but impossible." I felt the weight return to my chest. "Then this was no haunting?" "On the contrary," Holmes replied, reaching for a thin black notebook. "It was a haunting of the highest order. But not by spirits, by people, by secrets." He tossed a photograph onto the table, the daguerreotype of Aurelia Verus we had recovered from Maberly's study. She was clever, yes, symbolic, possibly even dangerous, but she died long ago. That much I now believe. Then who? Holmes held up a hand. "Consider, Watson, who benefits from Maberly's death? Who was close enough to influence his last days, yet distant enough to appear innocent? Abigail?" He shook his head. "Too cautious, too composed. A silent witness, perhaps, but not the hand that moved the Queen. Lydia." He tapped the table twice, an affirmative gesture. "She lied about the last time she saw Maberly, lied about the letters, lied about the chessboard. But she told one truth. She heard the woman's voice once. That suggests proximity, familiarity, a shared language." "But the image in the window was a reflection," Holmes said, "of what Maberly remembered, not what stood there that night." He paced slowly now, as he often did in the final phases of deduction. "Lydia Broom," he continued, "raised under Maberly's guardianship, deeply educated, suffered financial hardship but refused aid, carried a history of estrangement from Abigail, and most crucially, she knew of Aurelia. She said so, her name, her fear, and she referred to the Queen as if she remembered playing against her." I stood. "You believe Lydia was not merely a ward, but—" "What, a descendant?" Holmes stopped pacing. "No, I believe Lydia was Aurelia's student." The idea struck me with such force that I sat down again. "A student of what?" I asked. "Of memory," Holmes said. "Of ritual, of psychological construction. Aurelia was a master strategist, a woman who used symbols to reshape narrative. And I believe Lydia, under Maberly's care, learned how to complete the game Aurelia never could. But why kill him?" Holmes moved to the mantel and lifted a small envelope. "This arrived not an hour ago. No sender, no return address." He handed it to me. Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper. At its center, a single sentence in fine script. "He refused to sacrifice the Queen. So I became her." I stared at the page. "She claims to be the Queen?" "She claims," Holmes said softly, "to have taken on the role, to finish what Aurelia began. The line between identity and symbol has blurred for her. She no longer plays the game. She is the board," I exhaled slowly. "Holmes, what do we do with that?" He retrieved his pipe and lit it with deliberate care. The smoke curled upward, drifting in lazy spirals across the ceiling. "We speak to her." That afternoon, we returned once more to Wellington Place. The house had been formally sealed, but Holmes produced a written order signed by Lestrade permitting temporary access. We found the drawing room still empty, the board cleared, the windows still gaping, but the oppressive sense of expectancy had faded. Holmes moved directly to a sideboard drawer and retrieved a small notebook. I had not noticed it before. Maberly's personal ledger, he said. His true one, hidden behind false receipts. He flipped it open, revealing columns of names and notations. Many were crossed through, but one line, faintly underlined, read simply, L. Broom. Q accepted. R. Sacrificed. What does that mean? I asked. It means she agreed to take the Queen's role, Holmes said, and that the rook, someone close, was removed in her stead. He turned to me. Do you recall the phrase on the linen? I nodded. Sacrifice the bishop. She watches the Queen. Holmes traced the page with a finger. But what if the bishop was Maberly? The rook a confidant? And the Queen, Aurelia, already gone? Then the game was not about death, I said slowly, but about legacy. Holmes snapped the ledger shut. Precisely. He crossed to the writing desk and took out a blank sheet of paper. In quick, careful script, he wrote a single line. You played brilliantly, but the board is no longer yours. He placed the page beneath the glass dome that once held the pawn. I suspect, he said. That will be answer enough. As we turned to leave, I glanced one final time toward the empty chessboard. The morning's light had begun to creep across the room, touching each square like a new beginning. Outside, the fog had lifted, and though neither of us said so, I think we both felt it. The game, at last, was truly finished. Chapter 9. The Echo of a Move. The fog had finally relented, and London emerged beneath a crisp, pale sky. Baker Street seemed brighter that morning, its lamplights extinguished, its chimneys puffing gently into a world that no longer bore the oppressive weight of the unseen. And yet, despite the weather's clarity, Holmes remained restless. He sat at his desk, fingers drumming on the spine of the Codex of Laszlo Verros. Though the chessboard had been cleared, the last note placed beneath the pawn's glass dome, and Lydia Broom named, if not arrested, Holmes seemed unsatisfied. Not vexed, precisely, but suspended, as though one thread still dangled from an otherwise perfect weave. I watched him for some time before speaking. You've brought the case to resolution. The Queen was not a spirit, but a construct, a memory turned into a myth. You've proven how Maberly died, exposed Lydia's manipulation, even dismantled the legend that Aurelia Verros had returned from the grave. He did not look at me. Yes, he murmured. And yet, you're still thinking of the final move. He turned to face me at last. Precisely. The Queen's final movement on the board. The piece that fell by no visible hand. That moment, Watson. It was not symbolic. It was real. And I cannot abide a real action without a real actor. You mean Lydia may not have acted alone? Holmes said, rising slowly. There may still be a player off the board. I frowned. You suspect Abigail? He shook his head. No, I believe Abigail was drawn into the game like we were. Peripheral. Her role was to observe and remain silent. I suspect she did so to preserve what little of her family's dignity remained. He crossed to the mantel and retrieved the now emptied codex. From its inner binding, he slipped free a folded letter I had not noticed before. A thin envelope sealed in faded red wax, marked with the letter L. I found this lodged in the book's spine, he said. It was not part of the original volume. He opened it carefully and read aloud. If the king will not rise and the queen cannot fall, the game is doomed to repeat. I moved the final piece not to win, but to close the game. Tell him that. Tell him I remembered. He folded the note again and tapped it thoughtfully against his palm. She admits to moving the queen. But that was after Maberly's death, I pointed out. You said the movement was independent. that it occurred before she arrived at the house again. Holmes turned to me slowly. I said the bishop fell before she returned, but I never confirmed the Queen's movement. That piece, the final one, may have moved at her hand. Not as deception, not as showmanship, but as punctuation. Then she wanted you to find her out. She needed me to, Holmes said. The entire case was a performance, Watson, a final act. Lydia knew Maberly would not give her the codex willingly. He clung to Aurelia's memory too tightly, so she chose ritual over confrontation, symbol over accusation. He placed the letter beside the codex and picked up the bishop. Now lifeless, its meaning spent. There was no ghost, no possession, only a woman who understood how to trap truth within suggestion. I sat back in my chair, trying to wrap my mind around the implications. Then why not come to us directly? Why not expose Maberly's secrets through law? Holmes smiled faintly. You said it yourself. This was a haunting. Not of buildings or bodies, but of belief. Lydia did not wish to punish Maberly. She wished to end him with poetry. She played his game and made sure he knew, to the very end, that he had already lost. He walked to the fireplace, took the bishop piece, and tossed it gently into the flames. There, he said. Let that be its last move. The fire crackled softly. A knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered a moment later, looking rather anxious. Begging your pardon, gentlemen. A letter has arrived, left by hand. No postmark, Holmes took it. The envelope was plain, ivory, and unmarked. Inside was a single page. Upon it, written in the same slanted hand we had now come to recognize, were 4 simple words. You missed one, Mr. Holmes. We both stared at the note in silence. Holmes turned it over. Nothing on the back, no seal, no hidden impression, just the message. She's still playing, I said. Holmes didn't respond. He crossed to the chessboard on the mantel, now empty, and placed the note where the king's square would be. I missed one, he repeated. But what? The player? The piece? Or the motive? I asked. Holmes turned slowly, the glint in his eye returning. Watson, what if this was not Maberly's game at all? What if it was hers from the start? You think Aurelia set it in motion, that Lydia was simply executing it? No, I think Lydia finished it. But Aurelia, she began it with a purpose we never saw. He lifted the note again and held it to the candle's edge. Slowly, under the heat, faint ink bled through the lower corner. A circle. Inside it, a spiral. The Queen's mark, Holmes whispered. I felt a cold shiver. Then what now? I asked. Holmes folded the letter neatly and slid it into the codex. Now, Watson, we wait. Because if there's one thing I know about chess, he said, it's that the game doesn't end until all the players are known. He turned back to the fire, and for the first time in days, allowed himself to sit. The codex remained closed, but the board, in some place neither of us could yet see, had already begun to reset. Chapter 10. The night in the garden that evening. As I returned from an errand near Regent's Park, I found Holmes standing in the middle of our sitting room, unmoving, a slip of paper in his hand and a strange tension across his shoulders. The fire had long gone out. The lamp was unlit. Only the gray glow of dusk spilled through the window panes, painting him in outlines. He did not speak as I entered, only extended the slip of paper in my direction. It was another note. Same cream-colored stock, same slanted hand. The night was never yours to move. I felt the hairs rise on my neck. Lydia again? Holmes nodded slowly. It arrived just after you left. Left on the windowsill. No footsteps on the walk. No sign of the messenger. She's watching us. No, he said. She's testing us. I dropped into the chair opposite him. What does it mean? The knight was never yours to move. Is she suggesting you've misplayed? She's suggesting, Holmes said, that we never had control of the board at all. He turned away, crossing to the codex, which now sat open once more on the desk. The pages lay parted to a passage I hadn't seen before. A diagram of the knight piece, surrounded by mirrored symbols. The annotations were sparse but chilling. He moves not by line, but by leap. The knight alone can evade the eye. He is the watcher's blind spot. Holmes looked up from the page. There is a piece missing, Watson. Not from the board, from our understanding. Another player? Holmes shook his head. A silent accomplice. Someone who moved in the background, unseen. Someone neither Maberly nor Lydia controlled. You suspect Harrow? No, he's an archivist, and too frightened by what he's seen. No, the knight in this game must have been someone close enough to the center to affect it, but distant enough to remain unremarked. He began to pace. Watson, do you recall what Lydia said about the final letter Maberly received, the one she claimed not to have read? Yes, she said it bore a wax seal, the same as the others. She recognized the scent of camphor from it. And yet Maberly kept that letter, didn't he? Burned others, but not this one. Why? I frowned. Because it didn't come from Aurelia. Exactly, Holmes said. And now I believe I know where to find the knight. He fetched his coat and turned to me with that fierce spark I had come to recognize. The moment when the chase resumes with full vigor. To the garden. Watson, Wellington Place? No, he said. Maberly's second property, in Richmond. His retreat, the one listed under a pseudonym in his ledger. I stared. How do you know of it? Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. He made an entry months ago. King's Rest. File transferred to WR. Only? One property company in Richmond. Uses those initials, Withers and Rowe. A quick telegram confirmed a lease signed under the name Henry Palwick, a name used twice in his other letters. We arrived in Richmond as the sun was setting behind a wash of pale gold clouds. The property, a low stone cottage behind iron gates, appeared peaceful, unassuming. No smoke from the chimney, no light in the windows, but the garden, large, walled, overgrown, breathed with the hush of memory. Holmes examined the gate lock, then produced a thin length of wire from his sleeve. In moments, it gave way with a click, and we stepped inside. The garden was unlike any I'd seen. Not neglected exactly, more like untouched. Ivy covered the trellises, but someone had once arranged them in deliberate patterns. Statues of classical figures lined the path, their faces worn by time. And in the far corner, just visible beneath the vines, stood a carved stone pedestal. Holmes approached it slowly. Atop it sat a single object, a knight chess piece, black, weather-worn, and unmistakably carved from the same ivory as the others. Holmes turned to me. This is the original knight, the one missing from the board. The one Lydia claimed had been sold, but it was never lost. It was placed here, by whom? Holmes crouched, inspecting the base. The underside bore no initial, only a spiral. By the Queen herself, he said. Aurelia, he gestured to the pedestal. This garden was her sanctuary, perhaps even her prison. Maberly kept it hidden, preserved. And the knight was placed here not as part of the board, but as guardian of the memory. We stood in silence. A gentle wind stirred the vines. Holmes rose slowly. The knight was the only piece that moved outside the logic of the board. It represented not power, but access, escape. I looked around. Then who moved it? He turned to me, face unreadable. I think Maberly himself did. At the very end, he placed it here because he could not bring himself to destroy it. He understood, too late, that the game had never belonged to him. Holmes stared at the knight as if it might leap from the stone. I believe, he said slowly, that Lydia's final note was not a taunt. It was a gift, a direction. She wanted us to find this, to see how far the game extended, to see that while she was queen, he was never king. I stepped forward and touched the night. It was warm, not from sun, nor from touch, but from something else. From memory, perhaps. Holmes, I said softly, if this game has now revealed all its pieces, what remains? He did not answer for a moment. Then, with quiet certainty, he said, now we learn who designed the board. Chapter 11. The architect of the board. The next morning, Holmes stood at the center of our sitting room, surrounded by fragments of paper, maps, copied ledger entries, and an array of chess pieces arranged not on a board, but directly upon the floor. Each square was imagined, yet Holmes moved between them with utter precision, like a priest navigating sacred space. The board, he said quietly, was never confined to Maberly's study. It extends across time, across London, perhaps even across lives. But today, Watson, we trace it back to its architect. I poured tea behind him and took a seat near the window. You speak of Aurelia Verus? He nodded. But not as a myth, not as a spectral queen or vanished lover, as a mind, a strategist, one who designed a game so intricate, so layered in metaphor, that even in death she remained present, not in flesh, but in consequence. I watched as he moved a pawn into a new position, then added a tiny label beside it. Voss and Parrot, dealer. She said you were the observer, he murmured. But she was wrong. Oh? He smiled faintly. You were the witness, and with that, he raised his glass. To forgotten queens, he said. And the pawns who choose not to become kings, I added. We drank, the fire crackled once more. And somewhere, far beyond the city, a game board remained in its box, pieces resting not from defeat, but from completion. Chapter 13. The Box That Never Closed. The weeks following the closure of the Maberly affair passed without remark, at least on the surface. London resumed its routines. The fogs came and went. Trains rolled in and out of Paddington, and the newspapers, as they always did, lost interest in things they could not name. And yet I noticed something peculiar in Holmes. Not restlessness. He had taken no new cases, though several had come to the door. Not fatigue. His energy remained intact. But a subtle watchfulness, as though he had heard a distant sound and could not determine whether it had already passed or was yet to come. Then, on a rainy afternoon in late November, something unexpected occurred. A letter arrived for me. Not Holmes. I was halfway through a chapter of The Ethics of Dust when Mrs. Hudson delivered the envelope. My name was written in ink so precise, so mechanical, that it might have been etched by ruler and compass. The return address was absent. Inside, a single line. The pawn may step off the board, but the game keeps its shape. No signature, no spiral, nothing else. I showed it to Holmes at once. He examined the envelope, the paper, the lettering. Same hand as before, he confirmed. But the content is colder. I stared at the line again. You think this is from Lydia? Holmes hesitated. No. Lydia's messages always bore the spiral, her symbol of legacy. This lacks any emblem, and the language is clinical. She wrote in metaphor. This speaks in code. I felt a chill settle over me. Then someone else has resumed the board? Not resumed, Holmes said. Preserved. He stood and walked to the fireplace, where the completed chessboard Lydia had sent us still rested in its wooden case, unopened since that quiet night of brandy and silence. Holmes reached for it slowly. Until now, we accepted this as a gesture of closure, he said. But what if it was an archive? He placed the case on the table and opened it. Inside, The board was precisely arranged, every piece in its place. And yet, something was different. The square beneath the Black Queen's starting position had been hollowed, not crudely, but with delicate craftsmanship. Inside was a slip of black silk, folded with ceremonial care. Beneath the silk, a second layer, parchment. Holmes lifted it gently. Written on it, in faded ink, was a single name: Laszlo Verus. I inhaled sharply. Her brother, the original chess master, the one who vanished after the match-fixing scandal. Holmes nodded. And yet he did not vanish. He built the codex, and perhaps more. He turned the parchment over. On the reverse side was a diagram, not of a board, but of a box. Each corner bore an initial: L-A-E-M, Laszlo, Aurelia, Edwin, Margaret, Holmes murmured. The original square. What is it? I asked. I believe, he said slowly, this is the first version of the board. Not symbolic, literal. A chest, perhaps, or a vault, something they shared, or something they locked away. And if it still exists? Holmes folded the parchment carefully. Then the game never truly ended, Watson. It only changed dimension. He returned to the desk and retrieved the codex. Leafing to the final chapter, he pointed out a line I had not previously seen. When the Queen's crown is buried, the King's silence becomes a map. He stared at it for some time before speaking. Watson, do you recall what Maberly said to the dealer when he sold the pawn? I tried to summon the memory. Something like, I waited too long. The bishop has fallen. The Queen no longer knows the board. Exactly, Holmes said. But it wasn't regret. It was a warning. The Queen forgot the board. Not because she lacked knowledge, but because someone changed the shape beneath her. I felt the implications stir uneasily in my mind. You mean, someone altered the rules of the game? I mean, Holmes said slowly, that someone rewrote them. He rose and crossed to the bookcase, removing a thick volume of government registries. He flipped through it until he found the entry for the Maberly family holdings. There's a parcel listed in Suffolk, rural, never developed. Listed not under Edwin Maberly, but under Verus Holdings, established in 1869, I stood. You think that's where the original box was buried? I think, Holmes said, that whatever Laszlo and Aurelia began, whatever Maberly tried to silence, it remains hidden there. A knock came at the door. This time, it was not Mrs. Hudson who answered. The door opened, and a figure stepped in without waiting for invitation, Lydia Broom. She wore a gray coat and no hat, her eyes as sharp as ever, her hair pulled back tightly as though she were bracing against a wind we could not feel. She said nothing at first. Then softly, I told you. The board holds its shape. Holmes stepped forward. You sent the Queen. But the King, he was never carved, she said, because he was never meant to be played. Then who rewrote the game? I asked. She met my eyes. Not me, she said. Not Laszlo. Not even Aurelia. The architect was the silence they all agreed upon. And the silence is kept. By the box, she turned to Holmes. You were meant to observe, to understand, but not to open it. Holmes's voice dropped. And if I do? She hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached into her coat and withdrew a small ivory queen. Cracked. Incomplete. A twin to the one Maberly had. Burned. She placed it gently on the table. Then, let it be your move, she said. And she turned, and left without another word. Holmes stood, motionless. The Queen sat between us. The board, it seemed, was never truly cleared. Only reset. Chapter 14. The Coordinates of Silence. The Ivory Queen remained on the table long after Lydia Broom had departed. It glowed faintly in the firelight, its cracked crown catching flickers of flame like an ancient relic refusing to vanish. Holmes had not spoken for some time. And I had learned over the years that in such moments, silence was not absence. It was construction. He was building something. "Holmes?" I finally said. He stirred from stillness, but did not look at me. Instead, he drew the chessboard closer and placed the cracked queen beside the pawn, aligning them precisely on adjacent squares. "She said the king was never carved," he murmured. "Yes," I replied, "because no one was ever meant to play him." Holmes nodded faintly. "A game without a king, without central rule. Every move, every sacrifice, every deception, it all spiraled around that void. The absence of a fixed center, that is what gave it endurance." He turned to the codex and flipped to its final page. There, beneath the now familiar diagrams, was a faint marking I hadn't noticed before. 3 curved lines, concentric crescents, spaced evenly apart. Holmes drew a ruler from the desk and measured the distance between them. "Equal," he said. "Perfectly. And that's significant?" He retrieved a letter from the Maberly ledger, the original document bearing the mysterious WR reference. I had dismissed it as a real estate notation weeks ago, but now Holmes traced his finger over the faint red stamp in the upper corner. "It's not a business seal," he said. "It's a map." He pulled a fresh sheet of paper and began sketching rapidly, translating the crescents from the codex and overlaying them atop the coordinates listed in the Suffolk deed. The effect was strange, an overlay of spirals upon a landscape. Then he drew 3 dots. One here, Withers and Row, in Richmond. One here, Maberly's chambers in London. And the last, the Suffolk estate. He paused. "Watson," he said quietly. "It forms a triangle, and its exact center lies over a woodland glade that, as far as I can tell, has never been surveyed." I felt a chill. "You believe that's where the box lies?" Holmes stood. "I believe that's where it was buried. And it is time we see it for ourselves." By midday, we were on a train bound for Suffolk. Holmes had contacted a local land surveyor under pretense of a geological inquiry and secured temporary access to the forested acreage. The carriage ride from the station was uneventful, but the silence within our cab grew heavier with every mile. Even Holmes, normally so fond of quoting Latin epigrams or scientific curiosities on long rides, remained still, watching the passing hedgerows with a gaze like a man studying old wounds. The estate itself was utterly unremarkable. A tangle of trees, overgrown ferns, moss-stained rocks. No road, no path. Only the sound of branches stirring and the distant caw of jackdaws breaking the wind. The surveyor, a Mr. Briggs, gave us a quick introduction to the terrain. "You're looking for a hollow, you said? Something like a depression." "Correct," Holmes said. Briggs pointed east. "There's a natural basin about half a mile that way. Local legend calls it the Widow's Cradle. Unsettling name, I know, but the ground there's soft. Maybe what you're after." We set off immediately, boots squelching in the soft loam. As we reached the basin, Holmes stopped at once. There was no mistaking it. A ring of oaks encircling a low, circular hollow. In the center, partly obscured by leaves, stood a low stone marker. I stepped forward. The stone bore no name, no cross. Only one carving, 3 concentric crescents. Holmes crouched and brushed away the moss. Then he stood. "We'll need to dig." Briggs returned with tools shortly after, and together we began clearing the soil beneath the marker. Within an hour, we struck wood. It was not a coffin. It was a box. A long rectangular chest made of darkened ash wood, bound in iron. No lock, no inscription. Holmes motioned for silence, then lifted the lid. Inside lay a collection of sealed scrolls, bound books, and one object at the center wrapped in black cloth. Holmes unwrapped it slowly. It was a king, an ivory chess piece, taller than the rest, heavier in the hand, and yet unlike the others, it bore no base, no anchor. It could not stand. I stared. "You said it was never carved." I was wrong, Holmes said softly. It was carved, but deliberately unfinished. It cannot play. He turned it over. On the underside, etched into the hollowed base, was a single phrase. No one rules what all remember. Holmes placed the piece gently back inside and closed the lid. We do not take it, he said. We leave it here. But why? I asked. Because that was their final move, he said. To bury the illusion of control, to leave the king unplayed, unworshipped, to remind those who followed that the game survives only if no one claims its center. We refilled the grave in silence, placing the crescent stone atop the mound. Briggs asked no questions. By the time we returned to the train station, the wind had shifted. The air felt clearer somehow, not lighter, but truer. That night in Baker Street, Holmes placed the cracked queen and the pawn back onto the mantel. We have found the architect, he said. We have found the shape of the game. And the box? I asked. Holmes turned away from the fire, his voice quiet. Let it remain closed. Then, in a voice even softer, and let no one carve the king again. Chapter 14. The coordinates of silence, the fee. Cracked queen remained on the table between us, like a question that had not yet decided how to be asked. Holmes, unusually still, studied it in the firelight. Not for beauty, not for craftsmanship, but for placement. Its relationship to the rest of the pieces that had arrived through the arcane machinery of the case, the bishop scorched in the hearth, the pawn from the antiquarian's shelf, the knight in the garden, and now this. This piece was not sent as a gift, Holmes murmured, fingers tented before his lips. It is not a conclusion. It is a key. A key to what? I asked, though I already knew he had some answer turning in his mind. To the center, he replied. Or rather, to what lies where the center should have been. He rose then, swiftly, and opened the codex once more. His finger traced the inked diagrams, concentric arcs, symbolic lattices, then a seemingly insignificant annotation in Hungarian near the lower margin. It's been here the entire time, he said. This phrase, akirali nem létezik. My Hungarian was non-existent, but Holmes translated immediately, the king does not exist. So the queen was right, I said slowly. There was never a king on the board. Holmes gave a half nod. Not in the conventional sense. But consider, Watson, not merely the absence of the king, but what that absence demanded from the others. A game played around a vacancy. A ritual with a missing god. He turned to the fireplace and paced. I've been treating this as a puzzle, perhaps even as a story. But it is neither. It is a structure, and structures leave foundations, which means they also leave shadows. He crossed to the ledger recovered from Maberly's study and pulled out a folded document tucked deep within the spine. I recognized it at once. The Verus property deed, listing several parcels held under pseudonymous ownership. But we already visited the Suffolk site, I said. We found the box. We saw the king, unanchored, unfinished. We closed it. No, Holmes said, tapping the parchment. We found a box, but we didn't find the first one. My breath caught. You think there was another? Not a chest. Not buried. A chamber. Holmes flattened the deed and pointed to the coordinates of the Richmond Garden, the drawing room at Wellington Place, and the Suffolk Hollow. 3 points, too clean, too symmetrical. They form a triangle, yes. But look, there's a fourth location hinted at here, written in older ink. I leaned closer. Faint and nearly erased was a notation in the lower margin. VR0 Street beneath foundation. St. Agatha's. St. Agatha's? I repeated. A decommissioned convent in Shoreditch, Holmes said. Once owned by the church, then transferred to private hands in 1868, the same year Aurelia and Laszlo arrived in England. He glanced up at me. It was Aurelia's first address. I felt the tremor of realization. Then that's where the board was built, I said. Holmes closed the ledger, or where the rules were written. By dusk, we were standing at the gate of St. Agatha's, now a half-collapsed chapel encircled by iron fencing and ivy-covered walls. The windows were boarded, the roof partially caved in, but the stonework bore familiar marks. 3 interlinked crescents chiseled into a lintel above the door. "This is the spiral before the spiral," Holmes murmured. "The mark of the architect." We slipped inside. Dust drifted in golden shafts through holes in the roof. Rotten pews lay scattered, and vines had climbed the pulpit. Yet the space beneath the altar remained untouched. Holmes knelt beside it and removed a rusted iron grate. A cold breath of air wafted up from the darkness. "A crypt," he said. He lit a lantern, and we descended. The chamber below was dry, shockingly intact. The walls were tiled in black and white squares. The floor bore a central emblem, an enormous chessboard, weathered but legible. Along its edges were niches, and in those niches sat the original pieces: the rook, the knight, the bishop, the queen. But again, no king, only a stone pedestal in the center. We approached it. Upon the pedestal sat a plaque written in Latin, "Ad perpetuum memoriam." "Nemo regnat nisi memoria," I translated aloud, "to eternal remembrance. No one rules but memory." Holmes stepped back, his face unreadable. "This was not a shrine," he said. "It was an oath." "To what?" "To silence." "To containment." He pointed to the wall behind the board. A faint mural stretched across it. 4 figures, faceless, standing at compass points. Each held a different item: a scroll, a chess piece, a scale, and a sealed box. Holmes spoke softly. They were the founders: Laszlo, Aurelia, Margaret, and Maberly. Not just players, custodians. I felt the air shift, heavy with dust and something more ancient. "Then the game wasn't meant to end," Holmes nodded. "It was meant to be maintained, handed down, evolved. And now?" Holmes turned to me. "Now they've given it to us." We stood in silence, staring at the board that had lived in symbols and whispers for half a century, and was now, at last, revealed in stone. Then Holmes reached into his coat and drew out the cracked queen. He placed it gently on the central square, the only one unmarked by time. "Checkmate," he whispered. Not as a victory, but as a benediction. ChatGPT said, Chapter 15, The Game That Never Ends. The following morning broke unusually golden, the sunlight piercing even the soot-smeared windows of Baker Street, like a final page gilded in amber. Holmes had not spoken much during our return from St. Agatha's, nor did I press him. Some revelations speak for themselves. The cracked queen now rested upon the mantelpiece between the pawn and the scorched bishop, their placement exact, deliberate, no longer mere artifacts. They were records of a game played in silence, across lifetimes, on boards no eye could fully see. I was writing up my notes, trying to thread coherence from the long spiral of events, when Holmes finally spoke. "You've missed something, Watson." I turned. "Have I? I thought we had followed it to the end." Holmes gave the ghost of a smile. "That is the trick, is it not? To make one believe the end has arrived, when it is merely a pause." He stood, removed the codex from its shelf, and opened it to the final page. But instead of the spiral diagrams or marginal notations, he laid a small slip of paper over it, a receipt, yellowed with age, folded 3 times, stamped with the faded seal of the Hungarian Royal Archive. He handed it to me. "It arrived this morning," he said, anonymously. "Couriered from Buda Castle." I unfolded it. The handwriting was immaculate, flowing, unmistakably feminine. "Mr. Holmes, you were not wrong to leave the king buried. But know this, the board does not vanish because the pieces rest. When memory persists, so too does power." LBI looked up, unsettled. Holmes walked to the fire and added another log, watching the flame catch. "Lydia never meant to destroy the board," he said, "nor to dominate it. She only wanted it remembered. The game was never about control, Watson. It was about preservation, of knowledge, of trauma, of truths too bitter for history books." I nodded slowly. "And the absence of the king?" "A metaphor," Holmes said. "A warning. Any system that permits a single mind too much influence is destined to collapse." The Vorus Circle built a system where decisions were distributed, like a board where every piece was both vulnerable and essential. He turned and faced me squarely. Maberly betrayed that. He wanted the king carved. He wanted power, not memory. And it killed him. There was a long silence. Then Holmes crossed to his desk, withdrew a sealed envelope, and handed it to me. "What is this?" I asked. "A resignation," I blinked. "From whom?" "From me." He smiled faintly at my confusion. "Not from everything, Watson. Only from this case. From this chessboard. Let the guardianship pass where it must. The codex, the queen, the documents. We'll deposit them at the Bodleian Library under controlled anonymity. It's no longer ours to carry." I opened the envelope and saw the cataloging instructions, written not in Holmes's usual brisk scrawl, but with uncharacteristic precision. The objects would be stored under the heading, "Artifacts without author." "Poetic," I muttered. Holmes nodded. "They will be shelved beside myth. That is where they belong." That afternoon we delivered the contents to the library personally. The archivist, a young man in owlish spectacles, accepted them without question, though his eyes lingered a moment too long on the Queen. Back at Baker Street, as evening fell and the fire dimmed to embers, Holmes removed the final object from his drawer. It was the pawn. He turned it over once, then placed it in the center of the chessboard he had never quite managed to complete. "Are you ready to put it away?" I asked. Holmes looked at me. "No," he said, "but I must," and so he closed the lid. Weeks passed. The city returned to its rhythms. Scotland Yard issued a bland report declaring Maberly's death accidental, his hoarded papers inconclusive. No mention of the symbols, no chess pieces, no spiral, but in quiet corners, in an antiquarian's half-shuttered shop, in the whispers between academics, in the narrow lanes of Richmond or the overgrown garden of Suffolk, traces lingered. One morning, as Holmes and I were sharing breakfast, a parcel arrived. No name, no return address. Inside, wrapped in black tissue, was a single page. Holmes unfolded it. It was a chess problem, complex, nearly unsolvable. 14 moves, he murmured. Mate in 14. I looked at the notation, crisscrossing lines. Deceptive simplicity. And then I saw it. The final move. The pawn. Promoted. Not to a queen, but to a bishop. I met Holmes's gaze. "She's still playing." He gave the faintest of nods. "As are we." That night, Holmes stood by the window, watching the fog roll across Baker Street. I joined him. "She left us the board," I said. "No," Holmes replied. "She left us the choice." We stood in silence for a time. Then he turned to me with that glimmer of mischief I had come to recognize as a prelude to something extraordinary. "Fancy a game, Watson?" And in the warm quiet of our sitting room, we set the board once more. Not to solve a case, but to remember one. The end.